welcome to the video. I been at the track. I get lots of questions about how to build shocks properly. I've built so many shocks over the years. I do find that off-road shocks are the easiest, but it seems to me like there's still a lot of people that find some way to mess them up. So anyway, we're going to try to make this as simple as possible so that you guys can rebuild or build shocks perfectly every time. So in order to do this, we're going to need a few things. Hopefully you can see at my pit board here. We're going to need a shock, obviously. This is a front of a TLR 22 5.0 Elite. We will be talking the differences between the plastic caps as well as the machined aluminum caps and how you treat those differently. So in order to do this, I need a few things. I prefer a clean workspace. You're going to need a caliper of some type so we can measure the shaft length or the distance from the... We'll talk about it anyway. Don't worry about it. I'm going to use some of this 1-Up Blue O-ring oil or grease works really good. Some shock shaft pliers. We'll also be using just the kit TLR shock pieces. So let's get into it. I'm going to try to do this as fast as possible, but as detailed as possible as well. All right, to get started, we're going to insert the bottom holder and open the shock. So at this point, the oil that I have in here is actually pretty clean. You probably can't see that. I'm going to dump it out in this recyclable cup here. And I'm going to let it empty out as best I can. It doesn't have to be totally empty because we're going to take the entire shock apart so I can show you a couple things as well. So we're going to clean this off. I'm going to pop this off and unscrew it. So there's in the shock, in the kit, there's actually multiple lengths of the shock bottoms. So there's the regular ones, and then there's twos. These are the +2s. I'm running the +2 shock tower. So as a result of that, I'm running the +2 shock bottoms. All right, so I'm going to take this apart. Really nothing to do here. I mean, you can check to make sure that the screw is still tight. That's important. A lot of us, we Loctite these on just with a little bit of blue Loctite, and it makes a big difference. So if you're finding that the piston's popping off, that's something you can do pretty easily. All right, so I'm actually going to take this shock fully apart so I can show you a couple of things. There's one tool that I forgot to grab, but we'll grab that in just a second, and I'll show you what we're going to do. So carefully take out the O-rings, the bushing, and the top piece. So we have 2 O-rings here. These are the black kit O-rings, nothing special. Also, we have the plastic inserts. The great thing about the TLR shocks is they come with the really nice inserts. So I'm going to show you a little trick that we've been doing recently. This is a M3 or a 3mm reamer. We've been actually using this to help clean out the inside of the shock pieces, so the white pieces. So you just run this through and it just cleans up and deburrs the plastic. What that does is it allows the shock shaft to move more loosely but doesn't create any leaks. So it works actually really well. So I suggest doing that. That's a good thing to do. We try to do this on every shock that we build nowadays. It does seem to make for a smoother shock. The TLR shocks are great. Honestly, the materials that come out of the box are fantastic. And we'll talk a little bit about why they're so good. I think the coating I think is important, and just the quality of the body and everything is really nice. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do to start the rebuild process in this case is these O-rings actually felt really good. If the shock shaft feels a little sticky, without any oil in it. That means that most likely the O-rings have swollen and are causing some friction on the shock shaft. So I would suggest replacing those. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get, hopefully you can see that, just a little bit of blue O-ring grease and just kind of smear them all over this. You don't need a ton, just need enough to coat both the inside and the outside of it. We are going to start the rebuild process by inserting the first O-ring, inserting the big spacer, inserting the second O-ring, and then putting the top on and then screwing it on. You don't have to go crazy with this. It does have an O-ring on it. You just have to snug it down. You're done. There's a bunch of opinions about how you're supposed to put the shock shaft in and which direction. I don't know. I typically put it in and just let it push the excess grease out, which seems to work pretty well. And I just clean that off. Good to go. Okay, next thing I'm going to do, because it's very important when you build your shocks that the shock shafts lengths are correct. And what I mean by correct is a lot of times the setup sheets will have numbers on it like 28 millimeters, 30 millimeters. In this case, I'm going to be setting the front to 23 millimeters. So I'm going to put on this shock bottom here, the shock end, and I'm going to screw it on. And then I'm going to use my calipers. That's where the calipers come in here. I always zero them out. And then I measure from the bottom of the shock body to the lowest step on the shock bottom or the shock end. So I don't measure it to the elevated nub because that will give you an incorrect reading based on how most people build out their setup sheets. Okay, so that is really close, 22.94. I try to get this as perfect as possible. For the front of the car, if you're setting it to 23, make sure both shocks are 23. If you're setting the rear to 28, make sure both shocks are set to 28. So here we go. Perfect. Close enough. Okay, feels amazing. This is what you want. You want it to be super smooth and just feel like it has absolutely no friction, and that's what it feels like. So really, really nice. Very smooth, which is what you're looking for. This is going to help us build a really good shock. Okay, next step. Take the bleeder screw out. Now this may seem odd, but there's some really important steps here. I always clean the bleeder screw off too. I'll show you why I do that in just a second. I'm using, this is 37.5, but obviously based on your track. We have a pretty high grip track here in Denver, so we tend to run a little bit thicker oil to help control chassis roll. So I'm going to fill this thing up, and there's really something important I'm going to show you. So the first thing I'm going to show you, and hopefully you can see it, may be hard to see, is that shock oil is in there and it's domed. So a little bit over the top. Don't go crazy, but just a little bit over the top. And this mostly applies to the plastic shock tops. That's because they're flat. And so if you have a little bit of dome in there, it will help decrease the amount of air that you get in. Now there's a lot of discussion about whether you need shock pumps to suck all the air out of the shock. I will tell you, my personal opinion is unless you're building bladder shocks like we do in on-road, you won't really need them, because essentially what you're creating without a bladder is something called an emulsion shock. And an emulsion shock essentially is a mixture of air and oil. And so sucking all the oil out of the body to just have it emulsify later on anyway seems a bit redundant to me, or not necessary. So what I'll do is once I put the oil in, I will move the shock shaft up and down a few times to release any air that may be under the piston. You can also tap out to get some of the bubbles up. I'm not going to go crazy with it because of how these shocks work. I'm just going to try to do my best to get some of them up to the top. Once again, that's pretty well domed. I usually check it after you move the shock as well, because there may be some air, and it will displace, the oil will displace the air as you're building it. All right, so next step, I'm going to put the shock top on. So now, in my opinion, there's absolutely no reason, if you do this correctly, there's no reason to take the shock cap off again. So we will actually snug it down. Now, you don't have to go crazy here, just a little bit of turn to snug it. At this point, this is where it gets a little tricky. So using another rag, I will try my best to show this off. What we're going to do is we're going to bleed it down with the bleeder screw out. And what we're going to do is we're going to hold the hole, the bleeder hole, into the rag and create essentially an area of oil that we will continue to bleed into. And the whole point of that is really to try to disallow any air from getting back into the shock. So I will go very slowly, and I don't know if you can see it, but hopefully you can. There's a little puddle of oil there. I'm keeping the hole and the oil flowing into that oil, very slowly moving it down. Take your time here. Okay, holding it down now. Hopefully you can see that I'm holding the shock down. I'm going to clean the shock off because it's going to have some oil running out. Once again, we already cleaned the bleeder screw off. We're going to put the bleeder screw in fully. So all the way till it stops. Don't overstrip it. It's very easy to do, so just take your time. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pump or prime this shock. I do it 30 times. You can do it as many as you want. I think 30 is a good number. So here we go. It's about 30, maybe a couple more. All right, now holding the shock down, so holding the piston all the way to the top essentially, I'm going to back the bleeder screw back off. The first thing I'm going to do is clean the screw off because I don't want to put any excess oil back in. And now as some of the bubbles begin to pop inside of the shock, they will start to come out. A little bit of oil, very little bit of oil will come out of the hole. And so I usually give it about 30 seconds or so until it's fully done. And then I will clean out a little bit of oil, screws clean, screw the bleeder screw back in, and that is a perfectly built shock with almost zero rebound, which is what you're going for. Now, if you're on a very, very bumpy track, maybe you want a little bit more rebound than that, but it's as pretty close to, and there's absolutely no sound. And a lot of times what I do is I go up to people's cars and I can feel the shocks, and it just sounds like they squeak. And what the squeak is essentially is air inside of the shock. All right, last thing I'm going to say. So this is a perfectly built shock. I'm ready to put my spring on and my retainer cup. And I'm ready to put this back on the car. This is a perfectly built shock. I will do the rest of them exactly the same way. Obviously, the only difference is the rear is going to have a longer shaft length, and so I need to make sure those are the same left and right in the rear, and then I will do the same, make this exactly the same in the front. Okay, last thing. When you go on the track, your shocks most likely have been sitting for a while, and because they're emulsion shocks, what's going to happen is some of the air, which there is air in here, but there's so little air and the oil mixture is so good that you can't hear it. It's like perfectly quiet. So what happens is as it sits, the air will rise to the top of the shock. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what I always do when I'm getting ready to go on the track is I will prime my shocks. So I know it sounds a little weird, but I essentially just move the shocks up and down a few times to get the mixture back right so that when I put my car on the track, it's ready to go. You have to use those warm-up laps to essentially get the mixture in the shock so that it feels correct. It's just something I do. You don't have to do it, but it does make a big difference. And when you reprime the shocks again, they tend to feel really, really good, and they're ready to essentially go racing. So anyway, I want to thank you for tuning in. I know this is kind of a long video. Hope it was useful for you. Have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. I'd be happy to help. But that was building a 3.0 shock on a TLR. This applies to both the 22 5.0 as well as the four-wheel drive as well, the 22X4. So essentially, these are the same shocks we're running on both vehicles. And they build exactly the same. The only difference would be spring and oil combination for that vehicle. So anyway, hope you found this useful. Once again, subscribe, comment, and like if you can. Appreciate the feedback from everybody, and have a great day.